think about this often. I'm like, damn, like that really, there's a lot of weird lineups right there. Or you could even think of it more simply, like if you date a girl and you're really in love with her, and then in the future in a totally different place, that didn't work out, and you meet another girl and you don't realize it at the time, but she happens to look the same way and talk the same way and have a lot of the same things. It's like you have a type, or did the type find you?
Right. And all these things kind of line up in strange ways, and that we are in fact choosing the past. And
we're choosing it?
Well, meaning when we measure it, we're picking one of these pasts, right? When it gets measured. Until then, it's in a state of both. It's like in a state of superposition.
And we're picking it
when we observe it, or
meaning we can say it went left or right.
Yeah,
definitively. Okay.
Definitively.
Yes.
But it's a little more subtle than that. It's actually saying it was until that moment, it hadn't gone either left or right. Okay. The cat wasn't alive or dead. It's not like it was alive and you looked and you said, okay, yep, it's alive.
Meaning it didn't do it 500 million years ago. We only say that afterwards. We only knew that it happened
We're
now.
picking that past. Yeah. Okay. And so this was so weird to me when I first heard about it.
Yeah, it's strange.
And I went and researched it, and turns out they haven't done this experiment cosmically, but they've done it in the smaller amounts of space where they send something to the satellite, which is say 1,000 miles away. So it takes less than a second, obviously, to get there. But we're talking very small time frames, and they try to send it through 2 slits or go around something to get to there. And they said they've basically validated that it's when the satellite measures the light that it decides whether it went left or right. It's the exact same thing as this, but in a much smaller scale. Mm-hmm. And so I looked around and I said, okay, this can't be right. What did the fathers of quantum mechanics think about this? Like Schrodinger came up with the example of the cat because the whole thing sounded absurd. Mm-hmm. You can't have a cat that's both alive or dead. It turns out now they're saying you can.
You can.
But so there's an obscure speech by Schrodinger in the 40s that I was able to track down. And he said that when the probability wave collapses, or when the observation is made, or when the measurement is made, that you are choosing from one of multiple simultaneous histories. So this is like straight from the mouth of Schrodinger himself. So it's like a multiverse, but in reverse, right? A multiverse is, we think of it as going this way. But what if there's more than one possible past? This is why I got into like the Mandela effect and say, how do you tie it to quantum mechanics? Maybe there are multiple possible pasts.
Wait, back up for 1 second. So if there's multiple possible paths, you're saying that there would be, in this scenario, there's multiple possible paths that exist within the same plane we're in right now.
Well, it depends on what you mean by plane.
So you and I and Alessia are sitting in this room right now.
Yeah.
However many people are listening are sitting in the room listening. Let's assume this was live. It's not. Yeah. Let's assume it was live. We are all in the time-space 2024, end of 2024, that we all exist in. But in your example here, if I'm understanding this correctly, there could simultaneously be 2 paths, one in which President Kennedy dies in Orlando and another in which he dies in Dallas.
Right. And one in which the Axis wins the World War II, and et cetera. So you could do that at a macro level. Now, most physicists say, okay, we only know this for particles. We don't know this at the macro level yet. So they'll argue with you. But the idea and the concept is there, and it's been validated that, in fact, there may be multiple possible paths that we're choosing from. So like in a video game, your character could have different memories. You could change the memories based upon where you are. You could save the game state, mm-hmm. and you could rerun it and take it in a different direction, and it would go in different directions. So let's tie this back to what we were talking about before with Fred Alan Wolf. And there are these multiple possible futures that are affecting you right now. It's possible that the future you that is doing this podcast is choosing the past that included all of these little things along the way that led you through coincidence, synchronicity, circumstances, ability, right? All of these things to this particular point in time. So there's like these weird observations going on between the past, the present, and the future. It's not necessarily what we think it is. And I think that is part of our calling or our story. I like to call it a storyline. And then we have individual quests and achievements within that storyline, which we maybe before we jumped into the game, we thought these are things we might do, like, oh, maybe I'll, explore this goblin cave. Maybe I'll do this. But in my case, it was be an entrepreneur, be an academic, be a writer, maybe choose one or two of the three, right? And I feel like we're always drawn to certain things. And sometimes the universe just rearranges itself to put us in a situation where we might have to do X, or it seems like the best option at the time.
It does feel that way. I think about this often. There's like little pings in the universe that happen that make no sense. Like there's a funny story with Alessi and I, right? Yeah. So one night early on in me doing this podcast, I smoked a little bit too much weed. I was chilling. I happened to see an account that was actually faceless because it was named after your old podcast that you did in college, the Social League. Comment in a Lex Friedman comment section. Lex, can you share what equipment you have or whatever? I fucking knew Lex was never going to answer this. Right. So in the moment, I was like, oh, I'll fucking tell this kid. So I like DM him and I'd take pictures of like a bunch of different things, then send some online stuff of other equipment and say, hey, this is Lex's studio. Turns out he and I become friends through that. He starts following along as this thing builds. He and I have the same birthday.
Oh,
which
really?
is kind of funny.
That's interesting.
He's from the opposite coast, but there's like some similar curiosities as far as like in our personality. And there's just like these weird things that line up. And now he's been sitting in here in New Jersey with me in a new place, not my parents' house, though he sat there too back when we were doing that as well. And it's like the universe kind of lined that up because Alessi's got his own YouTube channel and is a content creator. He's just younger than I am, and he's coming up at a faster rate than I did as well. And I think about this often. I'm like, damn. Like that really, there's a lot of weird lineups right there. Or you could even think of it more simply, like if you date a girl and you're really in love with her, and then in the future in a totally different place, that didn't work out, and you meet another girl, and you don't realize it at the time, but she happens to look the same way and talk the same way and have a lot of the same things. It's like you have a type, or did the type find you?
Right. And all these things kind of line up in strange ways. And so earlier I talked about the life review, which is like going back and reliving the moments of your life. I also believe we have a life preview or life selection when we are choosing which storyline. Like in a Dungeons and Dragons adventure, you're like, okay, this is the adventure and these are the quests or difficult things that I'm going to do. And these are the party that I want to play with, right? These are the other characters that I want to include in my guild or include, et cetera. There was a guy named Michael Newton. I don't know if you ever read his book called Journey of Souls.
Nope.
It was an interesting book. It was one of these kind of bestsellers back in the 90s as well. And he was a hypnotherapist, and he basically would regress his patients. And by mistake, one patient, he ended up regressing them to childhood, and then he went back before childhood. But it wasn't a past life thing. It was what they called the in-between state, what the Tibetans called the bardo, which literally means in between, right? In between lives in the Eastern traditions. Or you could say it's heaven if you're looking at it from a Western
Or
tradition.
could that be like a purgatory kind of thing?
It could be a purgatory thing. It could be a place before you were incarnated.
Right.
And some of these folks said they remembered, looking at a video of their parents, choosing the life selection, the life preview and life selection is what I like to call that phase. And they're like sort of deciding what kinds of things they might want to do. They're actually watching them. And then that with their people that are going to be significant in their lives, they recall setting up clues or certain things that will let them recognize that this person is important to me.
What kinds of things?
And they'll say they'll cram and say, don't forget, I'm going to be the little girl in the red bicycle, or a certain, laughter or something that if you've ever met somebody and you had this weird set of circumstances with them and there's something about them that you recognize, but you can't consciously say what it is. There's something familiar about them. It could be that was a clue that was set up and then you were supposed to remember, because the whole idea is when you jump into the game, you have to first of all forget a lot of stuff, but certain things still come through, certain pieces still come through. And I think that is part of the process of life, is not just our story, but our storyline and the people who are the other actors, if you will, within our stories. And you can choose to ignore those clues.
Yes, absolutely.
And you can choose not to follow the path, but sometimes life makes you go on a certain path,
And that's like the downstream of relationships too. I think about this all the time. It's like the days where, because I built my whole life on building relationships. It's part of why I'm able to do what I do right here, right? Things constantly turn into other things. We're really fortunate pretty much almost all the guests we get are through people I know and stuff like that, you know? And I think about the days where like I'm really tired and maybe I don't make the connections I'm supposed to. And then what does that do down the line for other connections I missed because of that, people I could have met? You know, like I'll look at people that I'm best friends with now and I'll think of all the different layers that it took to get to them that might have started, you know, in fucking 2011. And it's like, ooh, if I didn't meet that guy in 2011, I wouldn't, you know, forget all these people in the middle. I would have never met this dude now. You know, it's such a weird thing and it does fuck with my head.
Yeah, and it's like it's almost like a pattern over time.
Yes.
If you think of it, right? Because there could have been different possibilities that you followed. And I call this the multiverse graph, in that it's like different paths that you could have followed through all the possibilities of your life, or through all the possibilities of the physical world. If you draw a line through them, if you think of all these different places you could be, how are we choosing that? And I think that there's this weird element, you know, whether you call it, so in the Eastern traditions, they have karma, which basically I like to interpret as a series of tasks or achievements or quests that you might want to deal with, or you may want to, you know, have a certain kind of relationship. And so in my book, The Simulation Hypothesis, which actually isn't for sale at the moment because there's a second edition coming out. So we had to pull, Penguin Random House is coming out with a second edition. So
you're going to have to buy that one.
You literally can't buy the book today new. Maybe you can buy it used somewhere. I think the audiobook is still up for a few more weeks, but by the time this airs, I'm sure.
Yeah, we're going to air this in like 3 weeks, I think. So.
Yeah, but the new book is up for pre-order. It's the second edition.
Got it. Anything that is for sale, we'll have in the description link below for you.
Absolutely, yeah. But the basic idea of the second book was that there are all these different possibilities and we set them up for ourselves, but you can see a pattern over time. This links to this, links to this. And sometimes they're just inexplicable synchronicities or clues that we have that cause us to go a certain way. So, for example, I'll tell you a story of this young man, Steve, who was in college in Oregon, and he decided to quit all his classes, and he's walking around and he doesn't know what he wants to do with his life. And he sees a flyer for a calligraphy class. And he says, okay, I'll take the calligraphy class. And he gets to know all about fonts and, you know, the serifs and sans serifs. Steve Jobs, right? And so when he was making the Macintosh in 1984, which was, 15 probably years later, if he hadn't taken that class, like the first GUI, as we think of it, at least the first popular GUI, which is a Macintosh, would not have had fonts upon release. I mean, he insisted almost unreasonably, if you think of all the shit they had to do to actually build that computer.
He was a Nazi about fonts, man.
He was. But it went back to that experience.
Yes.
Right? If he hadn't taken that class and if he hadn't dropped his other classes, like there's this whole cascade of things.
And if he hadn't done mushrooms in the desert, all these, yeah, absolutely. No, right. Seriously. Like there are a lot of things. You look at anyone great. I love that you just gave that example. But you look at anyone great, there are so many things that had to not only happen to them, but they're like, I imagine like these doors that open and they have to have the curiosity to walk through. Yes,
absolutely. And I think that's a great way to think about it, is that we have these different doorways. By the way, his favorite book was Autobiography of a Yogi.
Yes.
And it was the only book he had on his iPad when his biographer, Walter Isaacson, visited him back in 2011. And then after he died, at his memorial service at Stanford, they gave out a little brown box to everybody. And turns out what was in that book, in that brown box, was Autobiography of a Yogi. It was copies.
Full circle right there.
It came full circle. And he went to India trying to look for some yogi that could perform miracles and do all that. He went to find this guy that Ram Dass went and saw. Do you know who Ram Dass was? He was like a Harvard professor who was giving LSD to some kids, and then they got kicked out of Harvard. And he went to India and wrote a book called Be Here Now back in the 70s. So this is like,
so he's part of MK Ultra.
No, he wasn't necessarily part of MK Ultra as far as I know.
Okay.
But at one point he went and met this guru, and they had LSD pills, and the guru was like, okay, give me all those pills. They're like, wait,
all of them?
Yeah, all of them. And he was like, wait, this guy's crazy. We're not going to do this. He goes, no, give them to me. No problem. And they're like, okay, what's going to happen? The guru sits there and takes all these pills. And Richard Alpert, who became Ram Dass, he's looking at him, and they're all like, this guy's going to freak out. And suddenly the guy started going, ah! And then he starts laughing. He goes, Kuchnehoya, which means nothing happened. And that's how he ended up converting to be a yogi himself. Was he saw this effect that the mind-altering substance didn't have on a guy who was more advanced. So Steve Jobs went to India looking for this guy, but he had already passed on, the Neem Karoli Baba. And so primarily what he did in India was read Autobiography of a Yogi, which was written in California, right, by Yogananda.
By an Indian guy.
By an Indian guy.
Let's give it to him. Come on.
Absolutely, yeah. But all these weird things happen along the
Yes.
way. So that was interesting for me that, eventually I wrote this book about Yogananda, and I had to look at these different stories to try to figure out, okay, well, what's going on, what's real, what wasn't. And it turns out that was his favorite book.
Thank you for watching the video, guys. If you haven't already subscribed, please smash that subscribe button and check out this clip's full podcast episode by clicking here or in the description below.